Okay, I think we're good to begin. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. I'm Aaron White, the North America Economics Editor at Open Democracy. We want this conversation to involve as much of you as possible, so particular thanks to all those who have submitted questions beforehand. And if you are joining us on Zoom or on Facebook, you can add your questions in the chat item as well as in the comments section. So we're here several days before the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to discuss the legacy of the war on terror. Now, several days after 9/11, George Bush declared that this is civilization's fight. This is the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom. Now, for many, like people in my generation, all I've ever known is post 9/11 world. I was only 6 years old living in Lower Manhattan. The memories are still quite vivid, but I was one of the lucky ones. Now, I document this reflection in a piece that will be published tomorrow for Open Democracy alongside all of our other 9/11 content. And according to the Brown University Cost of War Project, the cost of the war on terror has exceeded $8 trillion, with nearly 1 million casualties in major war zones in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Pakistan, Yemen, and elsewhere. And at this critical milestone, and on the back of the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, we're joined today by an esteemed panel from across the world to discuss the significance of this anniversary and what the future might hold for the war on terror. We're joined by Paul Rogers, who is an Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. He is Open Democracy's International Security Advisor and has been writing a weekly column on global security since September 28th, 2001. In fact, his first column for Open Democracy was titled Afghanistan, the Problem with Military Action. And we're joined by Kathy Kelly, who's a 3-time Nobel Prize nominated anti-war activist, founding member of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and co-coordinator of the Ban Killer Drones campaign. She has been to Iraq and Afghanistan many times. And we're joined by Rozina Ali, contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and a fellow at Type Media Center. Her writing covers the war on terror, Islamophobia in the Middle East and South Asia. She is currently working on a book about the history of Islamophobia in the United States. And finally, we're joined by Nabil Salih, engineer, independent writer, journalist, and photographer from Baghdad, Iraq, who is currently pursuing an MA in Arab Studies at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies of Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. His writings and photography appear in Al Jazeera English, Jadaliyya, and Open Democracy. So I thought we'd start off by just opening the floor to the question of what does the legacy of 9/11 and the war on terror mean to you? Paul Rogers, would you like to begin?
I suppose the main thing I would say is that the way 9/11 was responded to was primarily by military action. And that has been the dominant feature of what we call the war on terror ever since. But looking back after 20 years, we can see there have been 4 failed wars. Afghanistan is obvious, I think, given what has happened recently. But remember the first long war in Iraq involving American, British, and other troops, which appeared to have ended in 2009. That obviously in many ways ended in failure in terms of what was to come next, because very quickly we had a sort of Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphing into ISIS and then Islamic State. That faced a very intense air war between 2014 and 18, killing at least 50,000 people. And even since then, ISIS has actually spread in the Sahel, in Afghanistan, as we now know, in Southeast Africa and elsewhere. And then finally, we tend to forget about Libya, the primarily Franco-British war against the Gaddafi regime in 2011, a 6-month war. The end result of that was Libya is virtually a failed or failing state, which has acted as a conduit for violence spreading down to the Sahel. So that in all 4 cases, Afghanistan, Iraq in 2 different occasions, and Libya, we've actually had military failures, yet we still have the persistent view that these kinds of problems, which I believe go far beyond Islam, can be met by military control. The term I use is lidism. You keep the lid on things by military means rather than going underneath and understanding where the problems are coming from. We're not very much nearer seeing the need for that now than I'm afraid we were 20 years ago.
Kathy, how would you like to respond to that, and how do you view your own personal legacy and memory of 9/11 and the war on terror?
Well, I was in New York on September 11th in Manhattan, and I suppose somewhat naively thought perhaps this terrible event will create in people in the United States more empathy for people who have faced equivalent and far worse terrors, and often at the hands of United States militarists. And that perhaps, maybe, as I was getting ready to head back over to Iraq for, I don't know, maybe about the 15th or 16th time to break the economic sanctions, I thought maybe people will see how terrified people in Iraq are because they can't feed their children under the economic war we're waging. Now, I was, I think, very sadly mistaken. And I think that Paul has helped us understand that the question that should have been asked, when a crime is committed, you do investigative work, you try to do detective work. And instead, all the responses again and again have been military responses, which have only exacerbated the violence. And meanwhile, the greatest terror we all face really is the terror of what we're doing to our own environment. Now mixing that with pandemics, we simply can't afford to continue the unbridled militarism that has grown ever since the 9/11 attacks.
And Nabil, would you like to respond? You've written very poignantly about your own experiences of growing up and living your whole life in Iraq.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. It's rarely that us barbarians or inferior beings are given a platform to speak. We are better muted, but let me just start by saying they are not field wars, they are crimes. So I'll give a summary of what I have experienced from 9/11 until today. I watched that day on the TV with my late mother, how the planes slammed into the Twin Towers. And in late July, my late mother died in a hospital that is not even remotely close to a hospital because of the consequences of the invasion and the crooks that they have bequeathed us after the invasion of Iraq. And in these 20 years or so, we still, because of the trauma that is weaved into our daily lives, we still have bombs going off in our heads. We still have towers and buildings that we have seen fallen and destroyed, still fallen in our heads. Now, the war hasn't ended in Iraq. Iraq body count recorded 462 civilian deaths this year so far, and the year hasn't ended. And among them is our 37 children killed. And the children who do not die, and there's near 1 million poor children who work in exploitative measures, and then you see them begging on the streets beneath portraits of dead youth who perished in bombings or fighting for militias that give them, a few $100 if they give them, to give them employment. Our public spaces are securitized and confiscated by the corrupt, subsequent corrupt governments that have ruled ever since. We have an elections coming in Iraq. And the funny thing is that the United Nations Special Envoy recently, after the democratization of Iraq, urges the candidates not to abstain from, forcing or coercion and forcing or buying votes. And imagine, this is in short our reality in Iraq.
Rozina, would you like to respond? I was wondering if you can speak to as well some of the journalism that you've done around the domestic impact of 9/11 and the detention and FBI surveillance of Muslim communities in the US.
Yeah, I think on this 20th anniversary, it's very important to remember the people who died on the day of 9/11. But I also think it's equally critical 20 years later to reckon with the people whose lives have been completely transformed by what happened after. And to what Nabil was saying, entire peoples were decimated, villages were decimated. People ended up in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were displaced, their families vanished. At home, one of the immediate reactions that my family, that a lot of families that I've spoken to, their immediate reaction to 9/11 was fear of their own government, how the government would respond. And this was not an unfounded fear. Immediately after 9/11, there were mass detentions of people without charges. Some were held up to almost 2 years in prison for no crime. And these have lasting repercussions. We will get more into this, I'm sure, in the hour, but the legacy of 9/11 of these past 20 years has been an erosion of constitutional and civil rights at home. And abroad, I see an almost moral bankruptcy, a lack of a vision for what we want this world to be.
Thank you. And Paul, I'm wondering if we can kind of shift this conversation into thinking about who's benefited from the war on terror, who's made a profit. And can you explain a bit, I know that you've written quite extensively on it, this military industrial, what you term academic bureaucratic complex that's at the heart. You're on mute.
Sorry. The term military industrial complex was first popularized unusually by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his closing address after he'd done 8 years in the White House. Now, people may not recall that Eisenhower was actually the most senior Western military leader at the end of the Second World War. He was then a reasonably successful Republican president, serving 2 terms. But at the end of his second term, with his final address, he spoke movingly of the danger of what he called the military-industrial complex and the way in which you have entities, and he was speaking about the United States, but it applies to any country with a substantial military. You have entities which have huge power, huge lobbying power, and the rest. And essentially, any one complex, I'm mostly familiar with the one in Britain. I've done a lot of lecturing at defense colleges over the years and have met many of the people involved. You have arms companies, and there's been a consolidation of those into quite few in number. You have the military colleges, you have the university departments, you have the executive, the civil servants, you have the legislators and the rest, and they're all huge interlinks. Arms sales loom very large, and there's a very high level of corruption in the whole arms sales process. The thing is very much, well, an appropriate term in this case is hegemonic masculinity. The whole culture is very masculine, and essentially it sees the need for threats as being a necessary part of its existence. Unless you have enemies, unless you have discernible enemies that are a threat to you, then you won't persuade people to spend a lot of money on defense. But I stress this is a problem in any country with significant armed forces. It's true in China, it's true in Russia, in Germany, France, Britain, India, Pakistan, the United States, and many others. And there are many transnational interconnections. But the bottom line is that, well, even if it is unstated, war is very good for business. The ideal, of course, is to be able to arm both sides. That doesn't very often happen. But I mean, if you look at Libya in March 2011, just before the French and British started bombing Libya, the French had a team upgrading Gaddafi's strike aircraft, and the Italians had a team upgrading the armored personnel carriers. Those people were very hastily withdrawn for the bombing to start. And so what was hoped in many ways would be you ended up with a Libya which was pro-Western, oil and gas rich, would want to spend a lot of money replacing those arms, and NATO would want to spend a lot of money on replacing all the precision-guided missiles it had used. It didn't quite work out that way. The latter part did, but unfortunately for the arms industry, Libya did not turn out to be a great fount of new spending. Now that sounds cynical, but that is essentially the reality. And it is a system which is very, very difficult to break into, with all the revolving doors between universities, think tanks, and the rest. And it is a very profitable system.
Kathy, would you like to add to that and kind of speak to the role of media and culture within the US in propagating the war on terror over the last 20 years?
Well, I think we were underserved by the US mainstream media and the mainstream media in many other countries as well, because we didn't begin to recognize our own Islamophobia. And we were also sort of, I think, bamboozled into thinking that somehow the responsibility for 9/11 lay with Saddam Hussein, and then there was this ridiculous buildup of a cartoonized version of Iraq where only one person lived in all of Iraq, Saddam. That's all that US people seem to perceive. And then a blaming of Afghanistan. And meanwhile, you've got 15 Saudi nationals who were identified as amongst the hijackers. And to this day, the United States has seemingly no reluctance to keep arming the Saudis who now attack Yemen. So I think that the media were very subservient to the interests of the militarists and served those interests constantly. You have generals appearing as the pundits or the opinion maker shapers on cable TV shows and on mainstream talk shows. And we very seldom get the notion that those people might in fact be criminals, be liable for prosecution, were there to be an international criminal court that identified people who have engaged in war crimes.
Nabil, you've written quite extensively on this amnesia within the US media and culture. For Peace for Open Democracy, I believe it was last year, you said you were writing about George Bush appearing on Jimmy Kimmel, and you said that Jimmy Kimmel forgot to ask his guests about the cluster bombs he ordered to be dropped on my family's house in Baghdad. I'm wondering if can you speak to that and this critique that you've written about? Yeah.
Kimmel didn't forget because we are not even inside his head. I mean, just a few days ago, like a week ago, someone approached me at a local pub and asked me if I was from Iraq, and I told him yes. And he said, and I quote him, "I have never met anyone from Iraq before. My brother was there in Fallujah. He used to call the airstrikes in both battles." And how normal it was for him to approach someone from Iraq with these words just tells me that he doesn't know the pain that was experienced by us and the horrors that were meted out by his brother and small time and big time war criminals. I mean, if George W. Bush appears on Jimmy Kimmel and the crowds clap for silly jokes, if the Wall Street Journal gives someone like Paul Bremer a platform to pen an opinion piece and says that Iraq is prospering just a few days ago and on the right track, if warmongering columnists like those, and the list is long, still appear on TV, still regurgitate the same worn-out Orientalist tropes, and we are, of course, usually unheard, like I said in the beginning, then that sends a message that it is normal to do this to those people, to us. That's beyond dehumanization. We have went beyond that. Like I said, Aaron, we spoke briefly in emails yesterday. We are now like in a corner of oblivion where we don't exist.
And Rozina, you've been critical of the media's coverage of Afghanistan and Iraq. And in a piece that you wrote for Drift magazine, I found that you said that journalists did not treat the war on terror as a policy decision made by the Bush administration, but as the natural and inevitable order of things. If you kind of expand on that and build off what everyone else has been saying.
Yeah, I think one of the critical mistakes that journalists made after 9/11 was to take the government's word for it. They were not critical. First of all, they didn't treat the war on terror that the Bush administration declared as a policy. In fact, they treated it as a natural response. And we had reputable journalists parroting inaccurate statements, such as that the Taliban was the same as Al-Qaeda, was the same as Hamas, was the same as Hezbollah. the media helped create a world of terrorists versus us. That's not where most of the world falls. That's not where, it also completely dismisses the motivations for terrorist groups, why they arise, what circumstances leads to their growth. And, so there has to be, it's something that journalists have continued to fail to do. And in the past 20 years, the war on terror has succeeded in creating more militants and more terrorist groups than before 9/11. And if we continue as media to buy into this notion that terrorism is an ideology and this is a war between good and evil, it does two things. One, it completely dismisses the situations and circumstances on the ground that actually give rise to these groups, that build support for some certain groups. And two, it dismisses our own crimes. For so long, we had called Afghanistan the good war, despite the fact that we completely decimated villages, that we bombed hospitals, that we killed civilians. It's only now, with the pullout, that we're actually publicly reckoning with just the crimes that were committed there. There were secret rendition camps in Afghanistan. And yet for 20 years, Afghanistan was called the good war. And this is, I don't want to discount journalists. There have been incredible journalists who have done really, really important work, recording and gathering information and really exposing these crimes. But after 9/11, the main narrative was terrorists are terrible, all of them are the same, and this is something that we need to get behind. That's not what journalists are meant to do. Our job is to hold power to account. And one of the failures of journalists, especially in the years after 9/11, was not questioning the government's claims and the national security intelligence. Even as we know, I think one of the biggest failures was being duped into going into Iraq.
And Paul, what does accountability look like for you, do you think? And is it possible to transition away from this military-industrial complex, but also how the media has been covering these wars? So
it's possible. It's going to be very difficult because essentially the whole accountability issue, the whole accountability agenda is based on basically a deep misunderstanding. There's a very wide assumption now, primarily in countries such as Britain and, as far as I know, the United States, that, quote, the war on terror remains an issue for facing up to extreme Islam. And that is seen as the problem in all its different manifestations. This really is just the tip of the iceberg in the sense that there may be a problem, but we're seeing worldwide a transition towards such a bitterly divided world. I mean, it goes back to what Kathy was saying earlier on. We have extraordinary socioeconomic divisions. You know, the world's 2,000 or so billionaires increased their wealth last year by 20%. And worldwide, you get many, well, now billions of people who are relatively marginalized. And in more extreme cases, they are forced into almost being sucked into particular extreme movements. But these vary a lot in different parts of the world. You see people falling back on elements of their identity, whether it's religious, ethnic, nationalist, and the rest. And I think what we move, let me put it this way, it was said among Western scholars to an extent 20 years ago that basically we have moved into a clash of civilizations. I think, if anything, we're moving slowly but inexorably to an age of insurgencies, where people on the margins are getting so desperate the risk of violence increases. I think Kathy was really pointing in this direction. And the real problem with this is we now have a pandemic, which is far more serious globally than most people accept even now, which is making the marginalization even worse. And as Kathy so rightly said, the really big problem is facing up to environmental limits. And climate breakdown is not something of the future, it is actually already starting. I mean, it's a huge topic where we really just have to rethink what we mean by security and think it through again. And at the root of that is accountability for what has got wrong and accepting what has gone wrong. I mean, I agree with Nabil, to use the term failed wars is wrong. It's basically a series of mass crimes. But we have a huge problem ahead of us, and time is relatively short to get a more sane way of seeing the world in time to prevent far worse problems in the future. We can do it. There are positive angles, but it's a pretty big issue ahead of us.
Kathy, I'm wondering if you can build off that. And I know that you've written a bit about reparations for Afghanistan. We have a series actually diving into reparations on Open Democracy. Can you explain a little bit by what you mean by this? What should that entail? How do you even start a process of healing?
Well, I believe that reparations should be paid for the suffering caused, the damage done, the very criminal destruction that Rozina had mentioned. But not only ought we think about financial reparations, but also reparations ought to involve dismantling the very systems that have caused all of this wreckage and chaos and upheaval in the first place. And I believe that requires us to stigmatize war. You know, there was a point at which many people in the United States finally accepted, okay, tobacco poisons people. I think we need to see how war has poisoned environments all around the world. And I also, you know, with regard to that accountability, people in the United States have got to listen so much more carefully to what people from the wars, the places where our wars of choice are waged. We have to listen to the people who bear the consequences. And you know, if I could just quickly mention, I was asked by some young people to go to Camp Bucca, which was a terrible, very primitive prison compound in the far south of Iraq, very shortly after the 2003 shock and awe bombing. I'd been in Iraq through that bombing, and I thought, well, I don't really think the U.S. is going to let, you know, peace activists go into this prison. But amazingly, we were able to enter it. It was one of the worst places I've ever seen in my life. We were spitting flies out of our mouths. People were sleeping on the desert sands with desert sand scorpions and no blankets in the cold of the winter. And it was a really horrifically humiliating and dehumanizing place. And later we learned that one of the prisoners in that horrible Camp Bucca was Ali Baghdadi, who went down to found ISIS. And when he was transferred from Camp Bucca, he was taken to Abu Ghraib. And if I could also just mention that at the entrance to Camp Bucca was an oil painting that showed 2 passenger planes flying into the Twin Towers and flames erupting. And, you know, the idea, I think, for the US soldiers who were stuck there was, this is justified because of 9/11. And that wrongful conclusion was reinforced again and again and again.
Nabil, what does accountability mean for you?
Well, Sinan Antoun, whose novel, The Book of Collateral Damage, should, in my opinion, should be taught in schools in the United States and Iraq as well, because we have a lot of native informants who helped waged, you know, who in Sinan Antoun's words, pulled the discursive triggers. Sinan wrote a lot about the generosity and distributing pardons. You know, they distribute depleted uranium on us and pardons here in the United States. And the list is long, from the Blackwater mercenaries to Ed Gallagher and the rest of the gang. So this just, you know, encourages future imperial adventures. Iraq is still getting bombed, by the way. They're still bombing IS militants who are still active because, of course, of the security failure in Iraq. But who trained our security forces? No one asked that question. Paul Bremer actually in his recent piece for the Wall Street Journal that I struggled, if I'm not mistaken, to read, mentioned that how Iraq was exposed to international terrorism, but how did that happen? Also, Sinan Antoun spoke about how in 2003, when he went to visit Iraq, there was just one soldier at a checkpoint with someone. They stamp, ask a few questions and stamp passports. What about the rest of the border? The war on terror, in Sinan Antoun's words, engenders more of what it purports to destroy. Yeah.
Rozina, I invite you to respond. And also, I was wondering if you can kind of introduce how concerned should people be in the US about these calls to broaden the government's counterterrorism apparatus in the wake of January 6th and the threat of so-called domestic terrorism.
Yeah, I think, so I want to touch upon two elements. One is the foreign element, which is that, we might have gotten out of Afghanistan, but that does not mean that we will not engage militarily in Afghanistan. And that's because after 2001, we essentially, using airstrikes and drone strikes that we gave ourselves legal justification for, we were able to enter places like Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and we have continued to do so. The US did an airstrike just 2 weeks ago in Kabul, and I think this is something that we should not become complacent about. Drone strikes and airstrikes still lead to carnage. It is still it's still a manifestation of war, even if it's not called war. Regarding the growth of the counterterrorism apparatus here in the US, one of the things that happened after 9/11 is that our counterterrorism industry grew dramatically. We had almost 300 new agencies or restructured agencies. The Department of Homeland Security, ICE, those were created after 2001. We poured in so much money into the counterterrorism industry, but the problem was that our supply did not meet the actual demand. We did not have, or the other way around, rather, the demand did not meet the supply. We did not actually have enough terrorists to catch. So we ended up manufacturing terrorists. And the way we did that was to use informants, it was to broaden out when and where we could surveil communities. There are hundreds of people who were sent to prison after 9/11, mostly Muslim, who had not committed an actual act of violence, who were actually arrested and detained for years for things they said. They were entrapped. They were mostly vulnerable men. They were poor. They had low IQ. They are in prison, and the US has said, look at this, our war on terror has succeeded. Unfortunately, 20 years later, we still don't have transparency about when and why and where the FBI uses its informants. We still have no transparency about how the US decides to place some detainees in high security maximum prisons where they're not allowed to speak to anybody. We have a little transparency about when and how national security is used against people. People were convicted after secret evidence being used against them, which means that they were not allowed to see the evidence against them that they could then refute. This is a violation of constitutional rights. Our constitutional rights say that we should be able to defend ourselves in courts. A lot of people were not afforded that. And we are now broadening this counterterrorism apparatus to use against other domestic threats. The FBI, one of the biggest threats that we might see, especially after January 6th, is the far right. And there have been actually far more far right attacks in the US than those perpetrated by Islamic terrorists. Unfortunately, historically, when the government has used policies to crack down on terrorism, to crack down on for national security, it has cracked down on political dissent, and it has cracked down on Black and Brown communities. We saw that after the 1995 Timothy McVeigh bombing of Oklahoma City. And we saw that after 9/11, and we actually see that after January 6th. And what's really frightening is that we are going to use the apparatus that we created after 9/11 to expand it and use it to curtail the freedoms and political speech and political dissent of a lot of communities that are not just Muslims, but other minority groups and Black Americans.
And Paul, what do you think is going to come next for the Biden administration in the foreign policy sphere? He sought a new budget of $715 billion for the military. Drone strikes are likely to continue in Afghanistan. I was wondering if you can kind of speak to that and where you see the future of the U.S. military engagement in the region.
Well, the budget of 715 billion is large by most standards, pretty close to the maximum at the height of the Cold War. I gather that the House wants to add another 25 billion to it, so it would take it up to 740 billion, which I think may even be the largest. But in terms of the way the United States military is going, and it applies also to the British and the French and others, they will continue with what they see as the war against terrorism. It will be done in a very different way, as we've already seen. And basically the constituents of what we'll see in the future are trying to maintain control, lidism, wherever it is necessary. The primary instruments will be air power, precision-guided munitions, armed drones, certainly, the selective use of special forces, extensive use of privatized military, contractors whose deaths do not involve them going back in body bags to military bases, the use of local militias, and a lot of cyber warfare. It is all much lower profile, and it is happening now. The French have recently decided to withdraw probably a third of their troops based in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. But they're now started operating their own armed drones in the Sahel. The Americans have been for some time. It is accepted, if you look at a report from CSIS in Washington, and this it goes on what has already been said in one sense, that the number of people who will be described as on the extreme paramilitary side of Islam is 4 times higher than at the time of 9/11. So all the policies to limit that have basically been, well, counterproductive. And given the massive costs, I mean, we talk about the financial costs, the massive costs in deaths, all the work the Iraq body count has done so well, and other groups, the Brown University group, these just don't register. And it comes back time and time again that it's almost as though we live in 2 completely different worlds. The world from the comfortable West with its fears, which are often exaggerated, and what you might call the majority world, with all divisions in particular countries. But overall, there is a widening. And I think what we have to face is we are in an era now of a transnational elite system, which looks after itself. You have the wealthiest at the base, but there are many others involved, including certainly myself and people at my level, who are doing reasonably well compared with the majority of the world. And that simply does not get home among the world's elites, the probably 1.5 billion people who are relatively well off. So it's a huge task ahead. It may be that there are occasional signs of hope. At least Biden seems to recognize to a greater extent the environmental issues, such a contrast to Bush and even more so to Trump. And that is something. But our own government talks the talk, but doesn't really do anything seriously. So we've got an awful lot of work to do. And there have been successes in some places, but it's going to be a long task. And in my view, really from now until 2030 is the crucial time to try and change things for the better.
And Kathy, central to this paradigm and keeping the war on terror going has been the attack on whistleblowers and those that speak out from inside the government about what's going on. I was wondering if you've written a bit about Daniel Hale, who was charged for espionage for leaking the classified drone papers. I wonder if you could speak to that and the importance of protecting whistleblowers and the role that prior administrations have had in going after them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for raising that issue of Daniel Hale. I was just thinking about that as Paul was speaking, because the reality is that the United States government worked very hard to silence Daniel Hale. They call it venue stacking, and the choice of a venue for the trial was in a place where it would be very hard to find jurors that would be willing to hear him out. And they also were able to rack up so many charges against him that he actually almost had to plead guilty and forego having a trial. Otherwise, he could have looked at 50 years in prison were he to be convicted. And so they were able to get him to plead guilty to one charge. But Daniel Hale exposed government documents which stated, this is the US government kind of telling on itself, that for 5 months during an operation called Operation Haymaker in Afghanistan, 90% of the people that were selected for attacks were in fact not people who had anything to do with the US claim of being part of terrorist groups. And so the United States certainly wants to continue an unbridled use of drone warfare. And these are ghastly weapons that the drones are firing at people. If you could imagine 100 pounds of molten lead landing on your car or on your house, and then, it's like a lawnmower. These blades snap out and rotate so that they can chop a body to pieces after it's been hit. Now that's terrifying, and it does terrify people in Yemen and in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And so, if we really want to counter terror, we have to build justice. We have to build just systems that hold the warlords in the United States as a major warlord accountable. And we also have to get the courage to control our fears so that people in the United States don't somehow think our lives are so precious that if we were attacked, as we were on 9/11, then the rest of the world must feel the consequences. We lash out relentlessly. It's an almost childish view of ourselves in relation to the world. We're not the only ones living on this planet who've endured a difficult stretch. And certainly, I think we've never acknowledged the terror that we've inflicted through our nuclear bombs, our conventional weapons, our Guantanamos, our black sites. How do we get Americans to kind of grow up?
And Nabil, we're gonna open up the floor to some of the audience questions that were received initially. And one said, what can give ordinary people in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the US hope for the future? And if you want to answer another one, it's, does the war against displaced people and security through hard borders replace the war on terror? So what's the significance of borders or of opening up Western countries to more refugees and so on?
Well, we see it very clearly at the moment.
I was going to ask that for Nabil. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Nabil.
Thanks.
The first question or the second question?
Whichever one you want. Do you want to answer the hope?
Well, yeah. Well, there is no hope. I mean, young people who are in my age are either, they get killed for a Facebook post in Iraq. If they go to protest and demand better, a life akin to that lived and enjoyed by their peers, they get killed and mowed down in broad daylight. If they keep quiet and just try to, live day in, day out, then they gnaw at themselves and they suffer. And, you know, there is no life. I mean, that's why so many thousands drowned in the agency and the Mediterranean, and among them friends. And there are still many people I know who whose dream is to escape. Iraq is, you know, let me just say a few lines written by the late Iraqi poet Saadi Yusuf. This Iraq will go to the end of the graveyard. It will bury its sons in open country, generation after generation, and then it will forgive its despot.
And Rozina, would you like to respond and talk about the hope or borders and the apparatus?
Yeah, you know, I will say, I think what the US owes now to Iraqis and Afghanis is to open up our borders to them, to the refugees. But, you know, I do want to say that I am trying to be a bit more hopeful about what might come and what is possible. I think Kathy is completely right when she talks about justice and the need for justice. And it's not just because of the US's military response, but also the narrative that we've created, the frame of the world that we've created, that those who are not terrorists are somehow good. And because of this framing, we have backed governments, we have backed militias, we have backed groups in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, who have destroyed people. I have been on the ground in these places, and continuously the theme that I hear is a need for justice. I mean, there are people in Iraq, for example, who still don't know what's happened to their loved ones because they were disappeared during the fight against ISIS by US allies. The same thing happened in Syria. And I think we on the ground, as Americans, as Europeans, I think what we can at least start to do is to push against this narrative. We can actually support people on the ground in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in other places, by recognizing that most people don't fall into the camp of US ally or terrorist. They just don't. They have their own demands. They have their own visions for a political society, for peace. And I think it is something that we need to be actually engaging in. Yeah.
And Paul, would you like to answer one of those? And we have another question that came in as well, which you might want to take on, is what happens because of the economic sanctions, COVID, the climate crisis? What role is that all playing in further kind of radicalizing younger populations in these regions? And what does the future hold for young people and for other kind of regional powers in these countries?
I suppose in a nutshell, and again, trying to look at it globally, we have three failing paradigms. The neoliberal economic system, which although 40 years old, is still pretty rampant. It's changed somewhat, but it is not delivering economic and social justice at all. If anything, it's doing the worst. There are some very good economists who are thinking differently, suggesting ways to do things differently. It's not all competition. 950 million people across the world are members of cooperatives and mutuals and the rest. So there's a possible way forward. On the military side, as I've said repeatedly, we just had to rethink security when all it is about is maintaining control. And then the third failing paradigm is the environmental one, which is so obvious. The very fact that it is so obvious now, I think, gives some hope, because in that area at least in quite a few of the admittedly more wealthy countries with Extinction Rebellion and the rest, there is a recognition that there's a huge problem ahead. And there are also many real serious technological solutions which weren't available 30 years ago on renewable energy and the rest. But I think that of those three failed or failing paradigms is the one where there is some measure of hope. The others are much more difficult to crack. And I think we just have to recognize that. We just have to work harder at it. I have a definition of prophecy, which says prophecy is suggesting the possible. And all that means is that where you have huge problems ahead, any attempts to show a better way, if they can get through to a larger number of people, are more likely to score when it becomes obvious that there is no alternative to changing the way we do things. And I think that is very much the position we're in now. And this can be for academics, technologists, anybody working across the board has to recognize where there is possibility for progress, then you really grasp it and promote it. That probably says nothing for the kinds of situation that Nabil has been describing to us so eloquently. But that in turn is part of a worldwide issue, which all of us have to address. And I think, you know, in a sense, it is so easy to get hopeless, but it's absolutely essential not to. And there are many good things which are also happening. And those, I think, have to guide us in making sure that we have the commitment to work for a better world.
Thank you, Paul. Nabil has to run, so thank you, Nabil, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And we have a couple more minutes. So, Kathy, I was wondering if you'd like to respond to particularly the hope question, or how, or this process of what do you see coming next?
Well, I think, you know, at one point, people maybe manufactured weapons in order to fight wars, but now we manufacture wars in order to sell weapons. And I think there is some hope in the possibility that maybe not at the top levels of governance of countries, but you know, I'm thinking about people who have top levels in academia, or people who are at higher levels among faith-based communities, people who are who are leaders of their grassroots local communities, maybe, you know, certainly NGOs, and maybe even some corporations. If people could start to level with one another and be honest about the situation that we're in, and begin to recognize that we could shift. You know, our security obviously is not based in being able to be a menace to other people in other parts of the world to such an extent that they would want to, out of desperation, fight back or flee their own lands. Our security could be founded, if you will, in doing what the Cubans have done. These Cuban doctors, when there's a disaster, when there's a travesty, they go trooping off to other places. They offer people serious practical help, and they stay for years and years, and they're beloved all around the world. A country like the United States, with the resources that we've had, that we've squandered so regularly on war, could be a country which is regarded as a generous, as a helpful country. And that's where I think we'd find some hope. And perhaps with younger generations and their well-founded cynicism about where the leaders have led us at this very, very dangerous point, might be ready to say, you know what, we can't afford those militarists any longer. We've got to find a new way.
And Rozina, I'll end it with you. I'm wondering, can you add to that and talk about this younger generation in the U.S.? And I think there is a crop that is rising up, that is more critical of U.S. intervention. You have younger members of Congress, such as Ilhan Omar, AOC, Rashid Tlaib, that are now explicitly speaking out against this military intervention in ways that we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago. So,
yeah. Well, before you get to the current moment, I just want to recognize the masses of people who did go onto the streets in 2003 to protest against the Iraq invasion. And even though we ended up actually invading, it was the biggest anti-war protests in history. And it was incredible to see. And I think what's amazing about today is that we actually have I think the circumstances allow for these voices to become more prominent. There are growing calls to end the forever wars, which I think definitely helped push Biden towards pulling out of Afghanistan. There are more people who recognize that that these forever unending wars don't actually serve us and may not actually serve our national security. And what is incredible about people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, other progressives in Congress, at least here in the US, is that they are making the connections between between the military apparatus, pouring in money for these wars, and how that takes away from money towards our own communities, towards actually building infrastructure at home, for example. And I think these are things, these crises that that Paul was mentioning. These are crises that the younger generation is recognizing. And I was just speaking to a young Muslim policymaker just the other day, because his father had been deported because of counterterrorism measures. This guy came back to the US and he ran for office, and I asked him, why are you still invested in the US? Why did you run for office? And he said, this is my country. I have nothing else. This is my hope, and I have to fight for it. And I think this is what a lot of people, and especially the younger generation, I think recognizes, is that we have to be politically engaged because there is nothing else. We have to make our world better. And I'm really optimistic about where that takes us.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much for joining us, and to all of our viewers around the world. Please visit openDemocracy.net for more of our 9/11 related coverage, and to look back on this 20th anniversary as well of Open Democracy. Paul's first column, very much, I was told, kind of started off OD as a place where people came for thoughtful, progressive analysis. And please do also, if you'd like to check out, please sign up for our newsletter at opendemocracy.net/newsletter. Thank you all very much again, and stay safe.